Alright guys, here's an interesting story. The US Treasury just launched a $10 billion bond buyback, but what's really interesting is almost no one's talking about what it really means. On the surface, this looks like a simple operation, just normal market management. But dig deeper, and it starts to look like something much more serious. A stealth bailout. Let me explain. The Treasury is buying back its own long-term debt. That sounds harmless until you realize why. Demand for US debt is collapsing. Foreign investors are backing off. Major domestic buyers are slowing down. And instead of letting yields rise naturally, the government is stepping in to artificially hold the bond market together. And this is not normal. In fact, it hasn't happened in this way since 2002. And this time, the stakes are much higher. So why now? Because the US government is issuing record amounts of debt, trillions with AT, but the buyers are drying up. And if no one shows up to buy those bonds, yields spike, borrowing costs explode, and the system cracks. That's why this buyback is happening quietly. It's not called a bailout, but functionally, that's exactly what it is. Think of it like this. If demand for a company as stock disappeared and the company started secretly buying its own shares just to keep the price stable, would you trust that company? Now imagine that company is your government. This stealth buyback masks the reality. The financial system is under stress. The Fed may be pausing rate hikes, but behind the scenes, they're still propping up demand to stop the bond market from unraveling. And here's the part that matters to you. This impacts everything. Your mortgage rates, business loans, retirement accounts, inflation. If they can't keep this patch job going, we may see a massive shock across the markets and fast. So what can you do? Start watching the bond market more closely than ever. Stay diversified. Protect your assets with real stores of value, whether that's precious metals, hard assets, or other inflation-resistant tools. Because when the government starts quietly buying its own debt, you can be sure of one thing. They're more worried than they're letting on. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more no-spin financial insight. Because no one else is going to explain this to you like it really is. Alright, let's dive into this. The Federal Reserve just announced another bond buyback for a total of $10 billion. What does that mean? Well, it means the Fed is injecting liquidity into the bond market, buying up $10 billion of their own debt. But here's what they're not saying. This isn't about open market operations. It's not about normalizing interest rates or even managing inflation expectations. This is a full-blown bailout of the bond market. In normal times, the Treasury auctions off new bonds to the public. Investors buy them, giving the Treasury cash it needs to fund its operations. But these aren't normal times. Foreign investors have lost appetite for US debt. China and Japan, two major buyers, have been dumping bonds, leaving the Fed with a shrinking pool of buyers. At the same time, the US government is issuing record amounts of new debt to finance its growing deficit. So something's got to give. And in this case, it's the bond market. When demand drops, bond prices fall, yields rise. But the Fed doesn't want that. They don't want higher yields because that pushes up borrowing costs for everyone. Consumers, businesses, the entire economy. So instead of letting the market correct, the Fed steps in with a secret plan. The details are buried in fine print. The announcement gets little attention. But make no mistake, this is a bailout. It's not called a bailout because bailouts carry a stigma. Politicians don't want to admit they're propping up the markets, but this is exactly what's happening. And here's why it matters to you. When the Fed buys bonds, they inject liquidity into the markets. That pushes up prices, which lowers yields, which makes it cheaper for the government to borrow money. But where does that money go? It goes straight into the pockets of bond. That's you. You get to benefit from lower yields, which means higher bond prices, which means higher returns. That's why investors love bond buy. They push up prices and yields. But that also creates an illusion in the market. It gives the appearance of stability when there's really no stability at all. This is a house of cards. And here's the kicker. It only takes one buyer to drive up prices. One buyer willing to step in and snap up all the bonds nobody else wants. That's what the Fed is doing right now. They're hiding the truth, hoping no one notices, hoping we just brush this off like it's nothing. But I'm sorry, this is far from nothing. We should be asking questions. We should be watching this very closely, because when the music stops, and it always stops, we're gonna see who's left holding the bag. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more no-spin financial insight. Because no one else is going to explain this to you like it really is. See you in the next one.